So, welcome if you're watching this on YouTube. I will try and explain how step count works to the point where you can practice it in any category, as long as you know where that you're supposed to get encounters. So to start off with, I recommend you get two programs installed and up and running. First is PSXfin, which is PlayStation emulator. That's the best way to practice steps on FF7, even if you're running on PC or PlayStation 4. This is still the best method. I'll get into how steps are slightly different, but fundamentally they're all basically the same. It's just that PC and HD console are a little bit easier because of a little bit of quirk in the code compared to the original version. So the first thing you want to download is PSX version 1.13, otherwise known as PSXfin. They're the same thing. They just have two different names when you tend to search them online. Get that installed and up and running. The reason I recommend this is because it has a pretty good save system. You can basically make as many save states as you want, which is really good for practicing steps because you're going to be making a lot of them instead of just having 5 or 10 quick save slots and having to cycle those save files in and out of your files when you're using this on your PC. The second program you need to get is a program called Cheat Engine, which is a program you can use to analyze memory addresses and look at them. So basically, this is another program that you can download. It's free as well, and I'll run through how to do this. So to start off with, there are two memory addresses that we're going to focus on primarily, but I'm going to cover 5 in total. So I just need to get my notes up. And when you are on Cheat Engine, you'll have a window that's like this. This is just the main terminal of Cheat Engine. To get started, do I have any programs that I don't want to show? No, I should be fine. All right, to get started, hit the select a process to open button up the top and select PSXfin version 1.13. You'll have a process list pop up. When you click that button, you can't see it on stream because I'm not able to capture it, but there's a little box that comes up and you just select PSXV 1.13. Select open on that and you'll be able to find all of the memory addresses in this program. Once you've done that, click on the add address manually button and you'll have, I think I might actually just go to monitor capture for this. I think this is just going to be a bit easier. So this is what you'll see come up. So this is your add address manually button here, and this box will pop up. In the address, you'll need to put in a bunch of different memory addresses, but they're not just going to be like straight hex code. You can put in you can put in defined terms as well, which is basically a fancy way of saying you don't have to redo this over and over again every time you open up an emulator and Cheat Engine to bring up these. What you can do is in the address type out the following. So it's open square bracket PSXfin fin.exe plus 1899 BC close square bracket plus 30 close square bracket space plus, and then that will be at the front of every memory address that you do for FF7. In fact, that's in front of them. That'll be in front of every memory address for any game that you run through PSXfin if you want to learn other things. But to start off with, we're going to do a variable called step fraction, which is at the end of the plus, put in 9C6D8. And we'll call it step fraction. The description doesn't really matter. And for type, put in byte, singular. Okay. And you have your step fraction. Try to stuff up on cheating in Candy Crush. Nice. I love it. So step fraction is we'll just turn this down a bit. So it's still like you'll be able to hear it, but yeah, that should be good. Alright, turn down on mine. There we go. Okay, so step fraction is the single most it's the smallest unit of measurement that you can use in this game. And I'll take you back over to FF7 recording. So yeah, it's the single most Dear God, that looks horrible. Alright, it's just not going to be a very good size, I think. There we go. That's right, it's a bit on the fly, but it'll function. Alright, so yeah, step fraction is the single most, it's the smallest unit of movement in this game. It increases in values of 32 until it hits 256. When it hits 256, it never actually sits on 256, it goes back to 0. So you can go, I'll move up like 2 frames, 32, 64, 96, 128, 160, 192, 224, and then it cycles back to 0. And it just, step fraction goes through this endless loop as you move. On PlayStation version, it just constantly cycles through. It doesn't matter with screen transitions. On the PC and HD versions of the game, this resets to 0 on every screen transition. So if I move on to the next screen, it resets back to 0. This is the biggest difference in step fraction, in step count between the original PlayStation and the other versions. And it's why step count is easier, because you're basically getting free movement reset. Now, the next variable that we're going to do is called step ID, which is the bread and butter of actual step count. So you go back to add address manually in your cheat engine, and instead of it's still the PSXfin.exe plus 1899BC plus 30 plus, but instead of 9C68, put in 9C540. And we'll call that one step ID. If I can spell. And that is also a byte. And so now we have step ID, and you see step ID is still on 0. So we need to move on to another screen in order to show what's going on. Because this screen, when you start out, you can't get encounters on this screen, and step ID will only increase on screens that have that are hostile. Step ID. And we're not going to get into psychology, okay? So we'll move on to a screen that gets encounters, which is actually the very next screen. Okay, so this is what you should be on when you do a speedrun, because it's just run up, pick up the 2 potions, run up, do the first fight, up left, and you'll be on the screen with fraction 96 if you're on PlayStation, fraction 0 if you're on anything else. Now, step fraction will continue through its process of just going through that cycle from 0 to 256 and then resetting back to 0 in increments of 32. But when step fraction goes through that cycle where it goes 224 and then it kind of hits 256 but then just goes back to 0, it never sits on 256, step ID increases by 2. And this is where the game actually starts running through checks for encounters. So we can do that, and we've gone through our first check, which doesn't happen. And then you can keep going around, and step ID will gradually increase as you go through more. Now, what happens when step ID increases is that there is another memory address, which I will show. You don't really need to see this for the purpose of actually learning step count, but I'm going to just show you anyway. If you do want to see this value, the memory address for it, this is for a memory value called danger. It's 7173C at the end of that memory address. And I did not give that a name. We'll call that danger. And it is not a byte. It's 4 bytes. And so you'll see as step ID increases, the danger value also increases. So it goes up to 960, 1024. You see it's going up in increments of 64, I think, on this screen every time you increase step ID. And eventually, after we've run around and we've raised danger value high enough, we get an encounter. And then after the encounter, the danger is reset to 0. You keep your step ID number, but you don't keep your and your fractions will always be on 0, because the danger check only happens when fraction equals when the fraction cycles over and increases the step ID, and then it increases the danger value. That goes through a check that's predetermined throughout the entire run through of the game. This is why step count exists, and you'll always get the same results. So we'll go back to our just getting onto the screen, and we'll move on. Now, knowing these three things, you can basically make sure that you can get, you don't even really need to know danger, to be honest. Step ID, step fraction and step ID, and you can go through each screen over and over again to practice. To make sure. So for example, I've got step ID 8, fraction 128. I can go back and I can see if I can improve that. Step ID 8, fraction 0. So I save 4 frames of movement now. I may have done that on purpose. But that's basically how you can go through. You can set up a quick save and try and get through these screens in the least amount of movement as possible. We normally name Cloud C. And then you can go through the next thing on every screen, on each screen that has encounters, until you're feeling comfortable. So we'll start. Shit, damn it. We'll edit this out. Okay. And then you can keep going through each screen if you're having trouble with it. You're just showing us again. Exactly, yeah, professional streamer, totally. Yeah, like 20 viewers is totally enough of an audience to make a full-time income. Okay, so another thing that commonly another thing that step count has is encountered skips. Now, the first skip on the current no slots as of recording this is skippable, and there are a couple of others. So on no slots CC skip route that Zeal did, the first encounter, which we'll go through in a second, is skippable. The first encounter in the train graveyard is skippable. The first bomb encounter on the way to Corel is skippable, but a lot of people don't actually skip that. They try and get a right arm instead. There's like 6 of one, half a dozen of the other for that one. Like, it's kind of personal preference if you want the extra chance to get a right arm, or you'd rather skip the encounter. And the last one is there's one in Junin on disc 2 during the weapon raid. I think that's all of them. I can't think of any more off the top of my head. Now, how to actually practice this. So when you'll always get encounters, as long as you're on step count, you'll always get encounters on the same step ID value every time. And when you go into an encounter that's skippable, with practice as you run, you can nail down your accuracy on knowing where that encounter is going to be. Now, where the encounter is on this screen is, I think, step ID 76. I'll just double check. Yeah, 76. So, if you're in an emulator and you're practicing, you can practice your setup and actually learn where the encounter skip is. So we know we're going to get an encounter on the 76 step ID. Alright, so on the very next frame, we're going to get the encounter. So, bang, encounter. Now, the way encounters work is that if you open the menu on the frame that you're supposed to get an encounter, the menu takes precedence in the game's code and the encounter is skipped. So, in layman's terms, when you're approaching this, you have to press up for one frame, and then you have to and then triangle on the very next frame, on the frame after that, to open the menu. So essentially, you're opening the menu on the same frame that you should be getting the encounter, is another way to say it, which probably makes 10 times more sense now that I think about it. And so yeah, you can go through and practice this. So that's 128, 192, 224. So up triangle, and that skips the encounter. And so you can't skip every encounter in the run. It's just not really feasible. There's a couple of reasons for this. One is, if you took a look at the danger value, you notice that the danger value never reset to 0 after the encounter skip. This is why, so danger is continuing to increase, and you'll eventually get to a point where, unless you're doing an encounter skip where you can, you'll get into another encounter and then your danger value gets reset to 0, and then you're just off steps. Like, it's too difficult to basically know where steps is unless you memorize the entire step pathing for like 3 discs worth of the game, which is kind of ridiculous. So you can only do encounter skips on very specific encounters. The second reason why you can't do encounter skips is if you do an encounter skip before a scripted fight, which is basically a boss fight, or like one of those scripted fights in the story where you have to fight 2 of the Shinra guards outside Shinra HQ or things like that. Those fights will actually repeat because the game thinks it's basically it's a glitch caused in the game when you skip encounters when you're not supposed to, and the fight will actually duplicate itself because it thinks it's supposed to be it thinks its random battle is finished, and then it goes straight back into the scripted battle. This happens with bosses or any fight that's a storyline boss. So that's why you can only do encounter skips on very specific encounters. Outside of that, so that's basically what you can do. So you can go through each screen. Reactive 1 is a like the first thing that people have to learn, obviously, being the start of the game. It's also one of the more full-on sections of the run, for the main reason that you have apps, preemptive setup. And I'm not going to go too much into preemptive apps. It's basically just predetermined movement to make sure that you're on the right step ID when you enter an encounter. Oh, yes. Yeah, Neon just raised another point. There's a 5th encounter skip. You can skip being to Zanene's Preemptive in Shinra HQ. That's another one you can skip. It's not a big deal though, because it's preemptive. You're guaranteed an escape either way, but it's good to save time there because you don't actually have to go and load into and then load out of the encounter. So this is a pretty good screen to actually practice on because it's quite long and windy, to see what you get. So kind of a funny thing about this screen is if you get the encounter skip in your run, the step ID will be 154. If you don't get the encounter skip, it'll be 156. This makes no difference to the step route. You'll just get it in a slightly different position. Just skip the game, forehead. So yeah, when you're looking at this, don't freak out if you're like seeing different numbers. It just depends on whether or not you get the step. It depends on whether or not you get the encounter skip. It makes no difference in the long run. You'll just see encounters in slightly different positions. And then you can carry on and carry on. And then, as a small tip for trying to make the preemptive apps, because some people do struggle when they start out, this is actually a pretty big spot. Actually, I like to measure this. So we're on 182, 160. If you run all the way to the ladder after the jump, you've traveled 2 full step IDs. That was what? I saved 3 frames there. 1, 2, yeah, I saved 3 frames of movement just by jumping onto the ladder as early as possible. That's a small thing you can do. And it's just picking up on little details like this for each of the screens as you go through. And generally, like, you don't want to try and learn, like if you're just trying to learn step count when you're starting out, don't try and learn the entire run. It's too long and too intricate, because even though you've only got 8 directional movement, a lot of the screens are kind of twisty and windy, and it takes practice to work it down. And as you get through and get your step count later and later on into the run, as you're doing attempts, then you can like work on the new screens as you go. Other than that, we could talk about a couple more things. A couple of extra addresses that you might want to know is a value called offset. Now, offset's memory is 9AD2C. And that's a byte as well. Now, offset is just, it's not too important. It's really if you kind of like, if you're changing between different step routes, offset might change. But in terms of practice, this isn't very relevant. It's only relevant if you're changing things around in your route. Offset is a value that increases. So step ID will gradually increase until you get to 256, and then it loops around again. Just like step fraction. It just takes a lot longer to get there. When step ID hits 256, it resets to 0. It increases the offset by 13. And that offset is basically the largest unit of measurement. It's not really a big thing when you just learn out, but it changes things like enemy formations and where your encounter checks are and stuff like that. So it has to be right, but as long as you're doing a run where you're just staying on steps, then you shouldn't have to play with this. It's just a handy thing to know in case you switch save files around or something like that. Another one is enemy number. So add one more address. Enemy number, which is a byte as well, singular. The helps if you change the memory address. The memory address for that one is 71C20. And this is the number that determines what formation you get. So every screen has a table of formations for the different types of encounters that you get. And That is determined by the enemy number. And enemy number increases every time you get into an encounter or when you skip an encounter. So if you skip an encounter, it still increases the enemy number at the same rate. You don't have to worry about different formations. This is just another one of those things where you don't really have to pay attention to it, but there are certain points in the run where you want to make sure that you get encounters on specific screens. There's one encounter in Corel on disc 1, the train tracks, where you have to force it before leaving the screen. Usually you have to anyway. It's only if you get very good movement and fraction luck that you have to worry about forcing it. So that's just one thing to know. If you want to keep track of it, you can. And I think that's it. Yeah, that's basically everything. That's all the memory addresses associated with Step ID and how it works. There is one more thing I do want to cover though, which is what to do if you start falling behind steps. Yeah, perfect. This should be fine. Okay. So I'll just push the story forward a bit. Bollocks. Well, that actually is good because now I'm going to get the encounter in a bad spot. I'm going to be a little bit behind. Okay. So push the story here. But yeah, the enemy number is basically used to... It's monitored when routes are set up to avoid all the pincer formations because pincers cost a lot of time. Yeah. This is the tightest section, so that's why I wanted to use this to explain how to catch up on steps a bit. Yeah, that's fine, it doesn't matter. Alright. So on the current no slots routes, you need to get laser on the last screen before dying, and that screen is the only screen, and it's quite notorious for being a huge time loss for newer runners because they can't reach steps, because steps is pretty damn tight. It's not like frame perfect for every screen, but you can't really make mistakes. You definitely can't take wrong turns or anything like that. It's just too much. It's just too tight for that sort of stuff. So if you are having more trouble with steps, I'm not going to really go into too much detail on movement for every screen. If you want to see something like that, I recommend watching Dave Astereo's tutorial on YouTube. He's done a full video series and he goes into detail on the step count. It is outdated because it was before CC skip, but the step count up to dying is the same. And if you're having trouble at this point, you can go through those videos and it is literally word for word exactly the same. That said, you can still take those movement advices later on in the run as well because the screens don't change. It's just the step route and the amount of steps that you have to walk. Now, if you do start falling behind, you get an encounter here, and this is a pretty crap spot to get it, to be honest. It's not like, oh my god, I'm screwed, but... Alright. So normally here you would do a menu and you would walk one step and then you would carry on. Now, if you go into... Now normally you would do a menu here. Something along the lines of that. And this encounter, the next encounter to get to laser is actually quite unique. You only have to walk through one battle check, one step ID, in order to get the right fight. So the only time that danger increases is when step ID increases, but step ID is not the smallest form of movement. Fractions are. You can run for the first 7 fractions after an encounter and then walk the 8th and that still counts as walking, but you're making up some of that distance by running, because running moves 4 times further than walking. So if you're in a situation I've put myself in, I actually did this accidentally, but it actually works out better. You can run for 7 frames instead of just walking for 8, and you're going to pull that distance back a little bit. It is important, like yeah, that's why I wanted to use this, and I was kind of bummed I didn't have a save, but I managed to find one, an old one. You can only really do this, you can try and do this for multiple steps if you have to walk multiple steps, but it's a lot more difficult. You have to count frames pretty precisely. So what I recommend, if you do start falling behind, only do this for the first, like immediately after the fight. Don't try and do like 7 frames running, 1 frame walking, 7 frames running, 1 frame walking over and over and over again, because you're probably like, it's either going to take ages or you're going to screw it up. So only do this for like the first encounter check, and then just cut half a step off the walking steps that you do for situations where you have to walk multiple steps in your step route. But for this case, we'll do, well, we've got the memory values up. So go up to, well, we'll just say 192. 192 is fine. Walk for a couple of frames. Done. We can carry on. Made it. And then here you would learn laser, etc., etc. Oops. Alright. Other than that, I think that's all I wanted to cover. Any questions? Were you holding run and tapping little, try and move just fractions? Yeah, so holding run and tapping the D-pad. And you kind of have to count. You're not going to be able to look at your memory addresses during a run, obviously, so it's a bit of a guess. Unless you're able to actually like count frames precisely. But you can, after you've done it a couple of times, you can kind of judge the distance on how far you've run. And you can just walk like, you don't have to worry about walking 1 fraction. It would be the most efficient, but you can walk like 2, or you can walk for like 3 frames, and that would be pretty safe. Fractions are those horrible things that your maths teacher said were important. Okay, a little bit of a post edit. For cheat engine, you can save. We'll bring you back over to monitor capture for this. Alright. So for cheat engine, you can save your list of memory addresses and then load them back up. So I don't have to do this every time. Just do like a save as, and you've got like, just call it PSXfin FF7 or something like that, like I've done. And then when you open up Cheat Engine, just go File, Load your Cheat Engine folder, and then load PSXfin, and then that should just bring up the memory addresses instantly. If you've used these addresses, which I'll leave on the screen for a second so you can write them down. And that, now I'm done.